Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in this Wolfson Centre lecture series. My name is Lucy Brooklyn. I'm a lecturer at the Wolfson Centre and I'm going to be introducing our speaker today. Just a few things to note first. So first, this is a public lecture. So just to let you all know that this is being recorded and it's going to be posted on YouTube afterwards, where you'll be able to see this and any other talks in the series that you might have missed. Please make sure that you're signed up to the Wolfson mailing list if you'd like to be kept informed about these and any other upcoming Wolfson events, including the next in this lecture series, which will be a talk by Professor Daniel Michelson on Wednesday, the 8th of June, as well as the first talk in our biannual clinical spotlight series, which is aimed at practitioners working in the field of youth mental health, which is going to be held on Wednesday, the 15th of June, and will be featuring Dr. Dasha Nichols from Imperial College London's talk on understanding the pandemic-related rise in eating disorders. And we're going to put the sign-up links for those in the chat. Finally, just a reminder that this session is an hour and questions and discussions are encouraged after the talk. So please post your questions via the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Glyn Lewis, who is a Professor of Epidemiological Psychiatry and Director of the Division of Psychiatry at University College London, before which he worked at the University of Bristol as well as Cardiff University. Professor Lewis's work focuses on the causes of mental health problems, including depression, and aims to better understand mental ill health and devise treatments. He uses a range of methodological designs, particularly longitudinal studies, as well as randomized control trials, which he uses to evaluate treatments for depression. And I'm sure his talk today on vulnerability to stressors, reinforcement learning and depression will be of great interest to those of us interested in understanding and improving young people's mental health. And we thank him very much for coming to speak with us today. So without further ado, over to you, Professor Lewis.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you for inviting me to talk here. And so I will now go to share my slides, which hopefully will work. So hopefully that you can see those slides now. Is that all working okay? Really good. So I'm going to talk about, well, the title you can see, about vulnerability to stressors. Why I think this may well be related, or at least it's a hypothesis that it's related to reinforcement learning mechanisms. And I'm going to start really just by pointing out something which you all know, which is about the public health importance of depression. And this is a map of all the disability adjusted life years over the life course, you can see at the bottom, for all medical conditions. And that orange blob in the middle is those attributed to, as they put it, mental and behavioural disorders. And a big chunk of that is depression. And you can see that it's very important during the the working adults, if you like. That's when the main burden of depression is occurring. But we also know, of course, that many of those adult problems began in adolescence. And one of the problems, I suppose, with this public health burden is we know very, very little about what we should be doing about it. And as a result, if you look at the sort of league tables of where depression comes in terms of all this disability created in the world, it's been going up the league table. So you can see here that it was 15th in 1990, it's crept up to 11 in 2010. And I always used to say, well, who cares about infectious diseases? But I suppose at the moment, that's probably not something we should dwell too much on. But I suppose the point that this is a major public health problem in world terms and in kind of public health terms is important to remember. And we're also getting more depressed. These are survey results from the UK going back to 1993 to 2014, as you can see, and the rates of depression and anxiety have been creeping up during that time. So given this public health problem, the usual thing to do is think, well, how can we prevent, these mental health problems? And, in the rest of medicine, it's worth thinking about, well, what do they do? And what they do is they work out what causes the illness, and then they, if you like, reduce the frequency of that cause. So if they discover that smoking causes lots of diseases, they'll have a public campaign to reduce smoking. And public health is usually concerned with primary prevention. In other words, preventing illness in people who are well, and it almost always occurs outside the health service. It is usually about political or governmental action rather than treating people who are already ill, because of course we want the general public to be affected by any preventive means. And in public health, the cause is something that if you took it away, it would reduce the incidence of a disease. And as you know, causes are almost always neither necessary or sufficient. And we're dealing here almost definitely, as with most of the other kind of long-term illnesses in medicine, with things which have a multifactorial etiology. It isn't that there's just one cause or even sometimes a limited number. There are a lot of causes. And it's also worth remembering that if we are going to be introducing policy changes, our evidence must be strong enough to justify that kind of intervention. But again, something that is that depression really is best described as a continuum. So if we want to prevent depression, it's important we take allowance of that continuum. And one important thing, which again arises from public health, is that it isn't necessarily just the people with extreme values who meet case thresholds, who are individually disabled, that you need to worry about in terms of prevention. So if you look at this graph here, these are just scores of symptoms from the national surveys, and sort of 12 is often taken as a sort of case definition for somebody who's got mental health problems, and perhaps further up on that continuum are people who might be more severely affected, seeing psychiatrists or whatever. A lot of the burden in the population from depression and depressive symptoms is often going to be people who aren't meeting these kind of thresholds. And indeed, with this kind of population data, you can illustrate this as these Iechyd Meddwl at the IOP did some years ago now, that if you look at the aggregate disability explained by people with depression and depressive symptoms, the sub-threshold group actually in aggregate leads to many more million days off work than the people who are actually meeting our diagnostic criteria. And this is a common issue in public health medicine, in the sense that if you just try to prevent people who are seriously ill, you often miss a lot of the morbidity in the rest of the population. And it argues for so-called population strategies of prevention. So, for example, most people who die of a stroke have average blood pressure. And indeed, Geoffrey Rose, who wrote this book that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in prevention, made a sort of guesstimate that reducing the average blood pressure in the population by 1 millimeter of mercury would save more lives than all the high blood pressure clinics and medication that were handed out in the health service. So these population strategies, which are often occurring outside the health service, might have could have a great power, if you like, and more effectiveness in the long run in terms of preventing illness. So I suppose the challenge of, us, if you like, people interested in depression, is to think, well, how can we, work out what the cause is? How can we adopt this kind of mental or public health strategy and apply it to mental health? And in terms of trying to work out what causes are important. Of course, longitudinal data is absolutely essential, especially of the things that we tend to be interested in. And longitudinal or cohort studies reduce recall bias and reverse causation, which at least go some way towards addressing some of the limitations of observational data. I've done quite a lot of work on ALSPAC, but I'm a bit out of date there. The current director isn't George Davies-Smith, but it was founded by Jean Golding, who's there. And it's been going for many, many years. It recruited in about 1991 and 1992 in Avon. About 14,000 babies were expected. There has been a lot of attrition over the years, but what it does have, and this gives a snapshot of some of the measures in ALSPAC, which I know many of you in Cardiff know and use, but it creates this enormous wealth of data on mental health right through from birth till, well, we've got the 24-year-old data now, haven't we? So if we think about causes, in general, the idea is we should be looking at the incidence of disease. We take a well people, see who becomes ill, and calculate incidence. And this is actually quite difficult to do for depression. We've got this problem with the continuum, but we've also got the problem that depressive symptoms often start quite early in life, in adolescence, but arguably a birth cohort like ALSPAC is somewhere where you can do this. And we do have enough data in ALSPAC, and here we estimated what the incidence of depression was in that sample. And you can see that it jumps up enormously towards the end of adolescence, especially in the young women. And if we plot the depression scores, which have been done very elegantly here by Alex Kwong in Bristol, you can see how the scores rise considerably from the ages of about 10 or 11, first in the females and then slightly later in the males. Indeed, this is the period when the gender difference between females and males seems to arise because of this increased incidence at that time. But thinking about prevention, really, if we want to study causes, we should, if you like, get before this period when the depressive symptoms are emerging. Because we want to understand what comes before depression, because that's much more likely to be important in terms of cause and prevention. Now, one thing which I wanted to mention was, whether depression at this period, if you like, is the same as depression in adults, that big public health burden that I talked about right at the beginning. And there was this quite influential paper, arguing really that there seemed to be difference in risk factors between the early onset depression and later onset depression. And so we had an opportunity to look at this in ALSPAC, and you can see the results here. And indeed, when we first looked at the data, we seem to be finding a similar pattern. So, for example, for this social class, being of a manual social class, so your parents and family being from that background, you can see that the odds ratio for ever being depressed in that period gradually drops during this period, during the this adolescent period. Excuse me. And you can see this is true really of all those socioeconomic indicators we had to look at. But what's important to remember here is this is comparing people who were depressed in the 10 to 12 year period or the 12 to 16 year period with people who never became depressed during this whole period. And so if you like, the problem with this kind of analysis is that at 10 to 12, we're comparing people, if you like, with a super healthy group. We're not comparing those at 10 to 12 who've become depressed with those who weren't depressed at that age. We're comparing them with people who never become depressed up to the age of 20. And so by the time you get to 16 and 20, you've got a much fairer comparison in terms of the cases who developed during that period versus the people who were not depressed entering the 16 to 20 age band, but remained not depressed during that period. So if we do a sort of what I think a superior type of analysis, where we look at incidence of depression, we get a different picture. So if you look at the bottom here, you can see that even though in this past in the previous analysis, we seem to be getting this change in the strength of risk factors during this adolescent period, when we calculate incidence, so we're taking account of who's ill and well at that time, you can see that the increased risk associated with these socioeconomic markers is really the same during all these three time periods. So this story about early depression somehow being, or early adolescent depression being somehow different from later depression, certainly is not supported in the ALSPAC data. We do a more refined analysis. So I was saying, prevention is about cause. I think, given this data, we can say, well, we can still look at adolescent depression, and that's going to be informative in terms of trying to prevent depression, at least during these crucial periods in adolescence. And one of the big risk factors really is bullying. This is again data from ALSPAC on the kind of behaviours which the young people were reporting. And you can see they are quite common really. And it's also quite common for young people not to tell their parents and teachers, as you can see. And there is, again, a very strong association longitudinally between reporting bullying at 8, 12 and 13 and the later development of depression. And you can see there, even after lots of adjustments and things, we're getting an increased risk almost 3 times if you have reported frequent bullying. So this is quite good longitudinal evidence that this might be a causal risk factor. There is a complication, as always, in our area, in that at least some of this bullying to depression association may be to do with sort of gene environment type correlations. This is a nice study by, again in ALSPAC, one of my colleagues in UCL, which I wasn't involved in. And it illustrates that some of the polygenic scores for things like depression, risk-taking, as you can see there, are also associated actually with the reporting of bullying. So perhaps some of this association isn't, if you like, causal of the, well, it may be causal, but it might also have a genetic element in terms of why people get bullied. But just to sort of cut short a long list of what are the risk factors, really a lot of the risk factors which have been described for depression are to do with, well, stressors and the consequent stress. So, for example, there've been work on, which I was involved in, with sort of partner violence during pregnancy, and again, a very strong association, particularly for the more kind of psychological aspects of intimate partner violence. And again, longitudinal data. There was an earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, where there was also a birth cohort. And so those investigators looked at whether earthquakes make you depressed. And sure enough, and it's not really much of a surprise that experiencing that kind of disruption would affect your mental health. And if we go to something even more extreme, actually being deployed to the first Gulf War also increased the rate of depression in those military personnel who were deployed. So, sometimes when you read the literature on the cause of depression, I always feel, well, somebody's just found something else stressful and found there's an association with depression. And you feel there's a little bit kind of stuck almost in finding other nasty things which cause depression. So one way perhaps of thinking about stresses is using this kind of sort of simple heuristic model about what might be going on. So, if environmental stresses are a potential cause of depression, we know that people vary a great deal in how they respond to different environments. And part of that is to do perhaps with interpretation of the environment. So people can interpret things in different ways. And I'm going to talk about sort of Beck's depression theory and conditional beliefs as being an important factor which varies, which alters that interpretation. And there's also the biological response, if you like, things like the HPA axis and inflammation, that even if somebody experienced the same thing, interpreted it in the same way, there might still be variation in how that individual responds biologically. And likewise, if you're the sort of person who responds perhaps in a more stressful way to the environment, that might go back and affect how you interpret events, and might also influence what kind of environments you choose to be exposed to. So, clearly what I'm talking about here is the sort of resilience or vulnerability to stress. And, one thought is, a lot of these stresses you can't do very much about. Can we learn from the variation that individuals have to different environments in order to think about depression and what the mechanisms might be? So I mentioned about Beck's cognitive theory of depression, and I suppose that's been the major more psychological theory of why people might respond to stress in a different way. And it arose very much out of clinical observation, though this theory was developed before he developed CBT. And the idea is that through early experience, for example, perhaps an overcritical parenting, people form sort of conditional beliefs, lots of different names for this. I'm going to call them conditional beliefs, such as if I don't do things perfectly, I'm worthless. So then you get a critical incident, somebody fails an exam, and that activates this kind of conditional belief, leads to the thoughts and symptoms which we know in depression. And this is, as I say, arises from clinical observation and is central to cognitive behavior therapy, in that trying to identify and help people modify these conditional beliefs, certainly from a clinical point of view, seem to be very important in terms of improving long-term outcomes. And it's also a theory of why people might vary in their response to different events in their environment. There are lots of different names for this. There are a few of them. And as I said, I'm going to call them conditional beliefs in the main, but I might accidentally slip into calling them something else. But they're also calling things like underlying assumptions, dysfunctional assumptions, negative self-scheme and rules for living. And it's also very closely related, in my view, to the idea of depressogenic cognitive styles or attributional styles. So this is the other sort of big theory, if you like, of psychological theory of depression, which is sometimes called the learned helplessness or hopelessness theory. And I'm going to talk a bit about learned helplessness later on, but the idea there was that uncontrollable events lead to depression, but it was felt to be, and it arose from work in animals, and then it was kind of given this attributional style explanation by Abramson and colleagues when applied to humans. And they argued that you needed to attribute any cause of something bad to these global, stable, and internal causes. So, for example, if you do fail an exam and you think it's because I'm lazy, that's global because it will affect everything else in your life. It's stable because you'll always be lazy. And it's internal because it's something to do with you, which isn't some kind of external thing. But I must say, I think of these as really being different ways of describing a very, very similar phenomenon. So, you know, for example, if you've got the conditional belief, if I don't do well at work, then I'm a lazy, useless person, and then you fail an exam, you would end up thinking I'm lazy. So I think these are probably equivalent in terms of their kind of psychological meaning. And I'm a CBT therapist, so I prefer the Beck if-then conditional belief sort of approach. And these are some examples of these conditional beliefs, which arose out of a CBT trial that we did for depression. And you can see some examples there. And it isn't, you know, it seems clinically it's very helpful to do this kind of if-then thing, that there's, if I don't do something, there's a kind of standard, and then there's a consequence. And, you know, this was some work we did on the conditional beliefs identified in our trial by the CBT therapists in 3 centres. And we managed to classify them in this way. And really clinically, we noticed the same sorts of things were coming up when we were treating the patients, and thought that it might be helpful to put this together really for clinical purposes. But it illustrates, if you like, the clinical basis for the Beck theory. And there is longitudinal evidence that these kind of beliefs are related to depression. So this was a study done in the Alsbach mums, actually, in which they were given a questionnaire which included these questions during pregnancy. And we could then have a look at, you know, this is the negative self-schemas score in tertiles. And we can then see, well, what's the incidence of depression over the next period? And you can see it was quite marked increase in the rates of depression longitudinally in the Alsbach mums. Of course, one of the key things here is, are we just measuring depression? And you'll see that as you move from this column to the second one, we've adjusted for the baseline depressive symptoms in the mum. And you can see there's a big drop in the strength of that association, but it's still very much present. And also, perhaps what's interesting is that when we looked long term at the predictive ability, so when we look at the association of these measures of conditional beliefs in pregnancy, later on in pregnancy, after the birth, and then up to nearly 3 years after the delivery of the baby, you can see that the association with the conditional beliefs are called negative self-schema in this paper, really remains there even up to 3 years later, whereas the association with the depressive symptoms does fall off. So even, which again supports this idea that we are studying, if you like, a sort of long-term vulnerability for depression, rather than just a kind of mental state at the time. And there's other evidence. Lauren Alloy in the US has got longitudinal evidence using the cognitive styles questionnaire, which measure these attributional styles I mentioned. And you can see here that if they're high risk, in other words, they're showing these attributional styles, they're much more likely to develop depression over the follow-up period. So we also use this cognitive styles questionnaire in ALSPAC, but in the large, as you probably noted, that was a relatively small study. So if you want to administer it to thousands of young people, it's not really practical. So we developed this kind of self-report version, and you can see it there. So it's a bit of a complicated thing to do, because you have to say, you imagine you go to a party and people aren't interested in you, and then you've got to think about the reason why people weren't interested in you. And then you can see the various response options. So, you know, things like people not being interested in me at this party will not lead to other negative things happening to me. So you can see, you know, trying to get at these kind of global, stable and so forth dimensions. So again, this is associated longitudinally with depression. But what's quite interesting is that the most important element of it seems to be this global factor. And by that, it's in fact what, you know, I'm going to come on to sort of reinforcement learning in a minute, but it's actually the generalizability of the attribution. So, you know, the sort of questions, well, which I highlighted there in reverse. The reason for people not being interested in me at this party will cause problems in all areas of my life. You know, it's this idea that, you know, the cause is something which is going to apply to almost everything. So, you know, to kind of summarize, I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, stress causes depression. Let's study why people vary in their response to stress. And one of those major things is this Beck idea of conditional beliefs. But I think we all, you know, again, if we look at medicine, they often, when they're trying to develop models, they think, well, let's look at animal studies. So what can we learn from animal studies? Now, some of the animal models which, you know, are frequently talked about are things like the so-called forced swim test and tail suspension. These are rather nasty tasks, and it's that if you put a rodent in water which they hate, they will struggle for a period. And if you give them antidepressants, that period of struggle will be longer. And it's probably related to things like behavioral inhibition and serotonin. And it's the same with the tail suspension. But this isn't really a model of depression. Okay, it responds to antidepressants, but it's almost like a kind of bioassay of various brain mechanisms to do with this. You know, the perhaps slightly more convincing animal model is called the chronic mild stress model of Wilner, who was in Swansea University for many years, which are really sort of a repeated exposure to things which rodents hate, and that often leads to behavioural inactivity, a lack of grooming, and so forth. And this also responds to antidepressant medication. But this has proved rather difficult to replicate, and so hasn't really caught on, I think, as a useful animal model in research. But the other area which, you know, has been thought to be relevant is the area of animal learning. and I'm going to call that reinforcement learning. And this is all thanks to Pavlov, who's on the right, and Skinner, who's on the bottom left. And their ideas really were about how animals learn things about, rewards and punishments. How rats learn to press levers and get food. And, I've already mentioned learned helplessness, but that arose from animal work. And Seligman and colleagues discovered that that animals who received uncontrollable shocks then failed to learn about controllable shocks when they were put in a new environment. And their argument really was that this was a kind of deficit that had arisen, and it seemed a bit like depression in the sense that the animals were in a situation they could escape from or something, but they just didn't escape. However, it's, I think that, since then people have realized, well, animals can learn, they can learn to press this lever gives you food, but they can also learn, don't bother to press the lever, there's no food coming. And similarly with punishments. So it's not so much that this learned helplessness phenomenon of animals is a deficit, if you like. The brain is working perfectly well. It's just that they've learned that whatever you do, the punishments still come. And this is, a kind of a summary of all these various contingencies, which is in a book which talks about animal learning and reinforcement learning, illustrating all these various options. And if what you do doesn't affect punishment, then, they called it learned helplessness in this book, but you can also get learned irrelevance in relation to positive rewards. And what's perhaps interesting, for us thinking, well, what about the brain and so forth, is that there is, a lot known about the brain mechanisms in animals which are involved in them learning about reinforcement and punishment, rewards and punishment. So this is the classic study by Schultz and others showing that the prediction errors of the dopamine neurons in the ventral striatum seem to be, part of this mechanism to, how we learn to press levers to get rewards. And it's worth also reminding ourselves of what how the animal brain compares with the human brain. And for those, if you like, is the rat brain in the bottom and the human brain at the top. You probably spotted that. But what is very striking really is that the bits of the brain which rodents use to learn about reward and punishment, which is what used to be called the limbic system, the hippocampus, thalamus and so forth, are very, very, very similar to those bits of the brain in humans. The difference between the humans and the rats isn't, if you like, that older bit of the brain, is the cortex and what's developed since. And indeed, this is how kind of evolution works in general. If you've got a system which does work, you don't reinvent the system, you sort of build something on top of it. So, if reinforcement learning is important, those mechanisms may well be carrying on in our brains as well. I've just got one slide really to say that, which I'm not really going to talk about very much, which is the whole biological type response to stress in terms of the HPA axis and the inflammation. And of course, a lot of that work's been done in animals. I'm sure it is relevant, but not something I'll be able to talk about today. So, getting back to humans, when a lot of you might know this book, which is a bit of a bestseller a while ago, about Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist that got the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics because his work is highly relevant, of course, to how people make decisions, both economically as well as in other parts of their life. And his idea, which is almost certainly an oversimplification, has been criticized because of that, is that he talks about two processes. They're probably about 500, but dividing them into what he refers to as the online and the offline, I think is quite an interesting idea. So his idea is really that we have these kind of fast, implicit, automatic mechanisms of which we're not aware and which we don't really need to think about. And that's in contrast to, if you like, the rational bit of our brain that's sort of slow, explicit, deliberate, and conscious and reflective. And so if we have got these reinforcement learning mechanisms, you know, it's very likely these are the online type of mechanisms that are involved. And indeed, you can do experiments in humans, and this is some work of Ray Dolan and Quentin Hughes, my colleagues in UCL, in which you train humans on, if you like, something which is just like an animal task, which is you sort of go to win, no go to win, etc. And they behave exactly like rats do. So for example, if you imagine you've got to press a button to win, if you have a press a button to sort of avoid something, that's a little bit more difficult to learn. And again, and you can see here that the sort of success rates are exactly as you would expect in a rat. So no go to win is also very difficult. To hold back in order to win a reward is also more difficult to learn. And you can make people do these tasks in a scanner, and indeed there is evidence that the ventral striatum, which is the bit in rats that do this work, are also working in our own brains as well. So if we go back to our conditional beliefs and our rules for living, you know, this if-then format, if you like, strikes me that it is quite similar to the kind of things which you know, reinforcement learning can learn. It's sort of saying, if you do this sort of stuff, good things happen. If you do this sort of thing, bad things happen. And so if you like, it's you know, my hypothesis would be that, you know, these reinforcement learning mechanisms in the brain are learning things about the environment, which are in this sort of online mechanism, if you like, these automatic processes, which we're not fully aware of, but which still have a great influence on our behavior. You know, it's very similar to the sort of phobia model, of course, where, and in fact, you know, personally, I fell off a climbing frame when I was 5. I developed a fear of heights. And it was only a few years ago I really realized, you know, why have I got this fear of heights? And of course, it was because I had this quite bad accident when I was young. But I suppose it's not just those very simple contingencies you can learn. You know, you can learn lots of other sort of contingencies. I remember one of my patients saying to me that when she was in certain situations, it felt like her father was humiliating her as a child. And it's almost that, you know, those kind of memories and that learning from her own childhood had been sort of hardwired almost in herself, so that, you know, as a 50-year-old, it still felt like that when somebody, for example, told her off. And so, you know, this idea that maybe sort of learning, if you like, is crucial to this issue about vulnerability and how we react to stress is important. And, you know, coming back to this idea of the sort of stress, the life events work done, decades ago now by Brown and Harris was very much about kind of short-term stresses. They asked people, you're depressed now, what's happened in the last few months? And you can see in this graph that really, the evidence they had of an association between life events and depression was over quite a short period. It was over, sort of 3 or 4 weeks before the actual onset of their depressive symptoms. And that's really quite different from this sort of evidence from one of the, I think it was the 1970 birth cohort, where people who reported bullying at ages 7 and 11 still had an increased risk of depression, anxiety, even up to age 45 and 50. So, stress can, early stress perhaps can create this sort of vulnerability, which can last for many, many years after the events. And that's sort of slightly different from just being, like I gave the example of going to war. It's slightly different perhaps from that kind of stress, which is happening there and then, and it's clearly related to lowering of mood. So, what are the arguments? Just to summarize, that reinforcement learning is a basis for, what we could, well, inverted commas around psychological vulnerability, because clearly there are brain mechanisms involved. One thing is that people aren't really fully aware of the contingencies that one would elicit, for example, in CBT, and it's often seen as outside their normal conscious control. We hear so often people say, I know I shouldn't do this, but I still do it. Black and white thinking is one of the big sort of ideas, if you like, of ex-cognitive theory. And clearly this is all, this is very easily explained in reinforcement learning in terms of reward and punishment, which is very much a black and white model of the world, an approach avoidance. It does link vulnerability with reward and punishment processing. And of course, whenever we talk about depression and mechanisms, everyone's talking about positive and negative things. And again, I always wondered, well, why is it that all of a sudden positivity and negativity comes into this? And again, that of course is mirrored in the the way that reinforcement learning seems to happen. It can also explain long-lasting effects of stresses. If you use a learning model, then things which happen earlier in life can clearly have an influence later on. It's very similar, really, to the model of simple phobias, which, in a sense, are sort of generally accepted as a model of phobic anxiety. And it also unites the biology of learning with sort of what we think of as psychological vulnerability. So the question is, how can we sort of take this idea further? And coming back to the kind of Kahneman idea of kind of automatic processes, I'm very interested, therefore, in psychological tasks which are automatic in nature, if you like, that are not ecologically very sensible, but which might tap into these kind of brain mechanisms which we're not fully aware of. So one task which we've been interested in is emotional memory or emotional recall of emotional type words. So people are presented with words which are kind of nice or not so nice, and they're matched for length and usage frequency and so forth. And then they're asked to recall the words. And this is Kath Harmer has developed this task, and I've worked with her to investigate it further. So some of Kath's work, for example, here shows that and if you look on the right there, that if you're on antidepressants, you tend to remember more positive items. And this is over quite a short time period, a matter of days after taking antidepressants, both in volunteers, but she's also shown it in patients as well. So we tested this in a randomized controlled trial, the PANDA study, but unfortunately, oh, sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. So we've had a look at this in some observational data, and in our sample, we had a long range, a very wide range of depressive symptoms, from kind of no symptoms at all to, quite severely depressed. And we found an association with positive words, but not so much with negative words. So sort of graphically here, you can see this represented. So the top line of the positive words, so as you say, as you get more depressed, then the number of positive words you recall drops quite dramatically. But we didn't really find evidence so much that there was much of a drop for negative. But what we concluded was that depression is so associated, if you like, with less positivity rather than more negativity. And we also looked at this task in a randomized trial, and at 2 and 6 weeks. Unfortunately, we didn't find any evidence at all that sertraline compared with placebo actually affected these this positive and negative word recall. So that was a bit disappointing. But I think, this is, we've also tried using these kind of more explicitly reinforcement learning tests in the context of trials. And I suppose one of the things which I'm interested in are the fact that, we might be able to kind of unify, if you like, sort of more biological theories of depression and the monoamine system, which of course are affected by antidepressants, with reinforcement learning and the sort of long-term vulnerability of depression. So coming to the end, really, what's the conclusion? And I suppose it's sort of perhaps the opposite way around from a proper talk, is I'm ending on a hypothesis rather than starting with one. But the idea would be really about sort of the sort of Beckian idea that early experience leads to these learned contingencies, which possibly via other automatic information processing biases, such as those we talked about with recalling words, affects how, the relationship, if you like, between stresses and depressive symptoms. And that's what we're thinking of as psychological vulnerability. So kind of in words, that contingencies learnt in early life through the mechanisms of classical and operant conditioning underlying the vulnerability distresses that increases the risk of depression. And that these contingencies are summarized in the form of the Beckian conditional beliefs, or possibly the learned helplessness attribution styles. And that the contingencies can be investigated by just studying implicit or automatic psychological processes. And I suppose just the sort of final thing is that, maybe similar things are going on with some of these more biological responses, in that there is a little bit of evidence that sort of early experiences can affect long-term sort of hormonal type stress responses and perhaps inflammatory responses, which can also perhaps affect this mechanism. As I said, no time to discuss that today. And finally, what are the kind of implications of if this theory is supported? And I suppose the first one is about whether we can change environments to reduce the chance of unhelpful conditional beliefs. One of the themes that comes through on the, clinically in terms of the conditional beliefs is the issue of perfectionism. And you can, patients are often quite explicit about the kind of standards that were set by parents and schools and perhaps the social milieu in which they were brought up as young people. And maybe we need to think about how we reward and discipline children as young people, because those kind of those rewards and punishments might be lasting, might be leading to long-lasting effects on their mental health. And secondly, from a clinical point of view, maybe in CBT, we need to have more emphasis on the behavioural strategies for managing conditional beliefs. One of the techniques to change people's beliefs is to get them to act against them, which in reinforcement learning parlance would be the same as extinction. But maybe we need to think much more about sort of unlearning things which people have learned and using that kind of language and using it to inform our therapeutic strategies. So that's all I wanted to say. So I'd just like to thank all my excellent collaborators and the funders, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely excellent talk that I'm sure everyone enjoyed very much. We've got a couple of minutes left for questions now, and I can see there have already been a couple posted. So a reminder for others that you can post questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we've had one in from Eleanor Mawson, who said, thanks for the really interesting talk. If the environmental factors that lead to learned helplessness during early life are affecting the setup of reward systems in the brain, how effective can cognitive therapies be in undoing the damage in adulthood? Have there been any findings on changes in these systems pre and post CBT?
No, that's a very good point. And I suppose I touched on it right at the end, in that in CBT, part of the process is to try to identify these conditional beliefs and then try to help people kind of come up with a different set of beliefs. And there are various ways of doing that, but certainly one of the ways is to try to make people act against those beliefs. So if you have somebody who is very perfectionist and say, if I'm not doing things perfectly, then, I'm a useless person or whatever, you kind of encourage them to sort of do things badly, if you like, and to, sort of gradually push the boundaries of their own comfort zone in terms of what they do and don't do to the usually quite high standards they're setting. So, I think it is possible to change these. And of course, if we, the thing with what I also like about a learning type model for explaining at least some of depression is that it's not that there's anything wrong with your brain, if you like. It's just that sort of things have happened. You've learned how to deal with those as a young person or a child or young adult sometimes. So it isn't that you can't unlearn those. It might be difficult, but you can still have that capacity for sort of unlearning what you've learned, or forgetting perhaps, rather than some kind of thing in your brain which you can't do anything about. But the second bit about trying to test this more explicitly in trials, I think is a challenge which obviously we're trying to do at the moment, and but there's certainly no data at the moment that I can point to support it.
Okay, thank you very much. It's 3 o'clock, so I feel like I should probably wrap things up. I'm sure that if anyone has any questions, then Glyn would be happy to take them another time. And I can see people are posting, and perhaps we can officially stop the session and some people can hang around if they want to. But for those of you that have to leave, thank you very much for coming. And just a reminder to please sign up for upcoming lecture series and for our mailing list so that you can keep up to date with all of our ongoing events. Thanks very much.